This point in your educational career, you've probably gotten a lot of advice and information about how to study, so it might seem a little silly for me to include a module like this. Bear with me though. I'm hoping that what I want to share is a little different, and I think it might add value to all the other things you've heard. That said, and given that this is a research methods class, I want to start with what we know from research and the related theories. The resources on the Learning Strategies page include links to a couple of related articles, but our current knowledge can be summarized with one relatively simple idea. It's all about the connections in our brain. Learning is about more than just remembering pieces of information. It's about the ability to access, to retrieve information. It's a necessary part of the process. That basic idea helps us understand many of the common recommendations for studying and learning. For example, you might be a little tired of hearing that you shouldn't cram before a test. You should study a little bit over several days. But why is that? Why don't we remember things well if we cram? It's because it doesn't create as many connections in our brain, and the ones that we're creating aren't as strong. So it reduces the chances we can find that information in our brains later. Cognitive load is one way to describe the mental resources we need to make all of the connections necessary to complete an activity or a task. Technically speaking, it's defined as all of the working memory required at any given time. The concept or topic we're working with contributes to cognitive load because we have to make connections to previous knowledge and figure out how to make new connections. That intrinsic load is influenced by the number of connections we have to make for any given topic. The concept or topic isn't the only thing that influences cognitive load, though. At any given time, we have numerous things that influence the connections we're making and how easy it is to make them. Sometimes those things help our learning, contributing to what we call germane cognitive load. Maybe it's an example that we have to think about a little bit, but that helps us understand how an idea relates to one another. Or an assignment that's different than anything we've done before, but it helps us understand. At other times, though, the things that influence the connections don't contribute to our learning and might even make it more difficult. That part of cognitive load is called extraneous. Sometimes things that are intended to help learning can actually add to extraneous load. Have you ever heard an example that was so hard to follow you weren't sure how it related? Or read a question on an exam that was so long and complicated you had a hard time figuring out how to answer? Those are both examples of how the learning process contributed to extraneous load. I used a picture of weights in the last slide because each of the types of cognitive load adds up, and kind of like with weightlifting and strength training, our cognitive capacity at any point in time is limited. Given that, we need to do what we can to make the intrinsic load manageable and maximize the mental resources we have available for germane load. So how can we make intrinsic load manageable? Each concept or topic is what it is, right? Right. But we don't have to tackle it all at once. One way to reduce intrinsic load is to break things down into parts, or in the case of this class, into topics. When I designed this class, I try to reduce intrinsic load by introducing one concept at a time, and then we'll think about how they fit together. Similarly, we learn about the meaning of the terms and concepts before we apply them to a design and a study. There are also a few things you can do to make intrinsic load more manageable. One is to look at the assignment and think about the steps it will take to complete it. You can also make a list of what you need to know. Completing assignments in order can also help you break down topics in a way that's more manageable. We can maximize the cognitive resources we have available for germane load, the load that helps us learn, by minimizing extrinsic load. I try to help with that by making the deadlines and expectations for each assignment easy to find. I also try to be consistent in the way I organize materials so that you don't have to figure out the organization as well as the related terms and concepts. Similarly, I provide multiple electronic paths to information, so it's easier to find what you need. The idea of minimizing extrinsic load is also related to a few pieces of advice students often receive. For example, you've probably heard you should try to minimize distractions when you study. If we think about it in terms of cognitive load, things that take our attention away from what we're studying represent extraneous load. And when we have more extraneous load, we have fewer resources for germane load. Here's another common piece of advice related to extrinsic load. Use a calendar or planner to keep track of assignments. Doing that can help reduce extrinsic load because you don't have to think about what you need to do and when you need to do it. Another thing that's going to be especially important for this class is organizing materials, especially electronic files, in a way that makes them easier to find when you need them. There are several files you'll need to find multiple times, and one thing that seems to make it more challenging for students is when they can't find what they're looking for. That's why I encourage you to save the files and think about your file names. On a related note, I also encourage you to use a system like Google Docs, Office 365, or Dropbox.com to save your files. They all have apps, so you save your files just like you're saving them to your computer, but they're stored virtually, so if your computer crashes, you don't lose your files. Takeaway message then is that we can make learning easier by using our cognitive resources in a way that makes it easier to make and use connections. Two relatively simple ways to do that are to think about things step by step and to organize materials so we don't have to think as much about where to find what we need.